On Sunday, December 4th, 2016, 32-year-old Rosemeir Silva and her 30-year-old fiancé, Udirli Damasque, were getting ready for their wedding ceremony set to take place in a picturesque rural area near São Paulo. Rosemeir had planned an impressive surprise, a dramatic entrance by helicopter to dazzle the guests and her future husband. But just moments before the ceremony was set to begin, an unforeseen tragedy turned everything into a nightmare. Rosemeir was a 32-year-old nurse assistant, born and raised in São Paulo in a large family. From an early age, her parents instilled values of kindness and caring, guiding her toward a career dedicated to helping others. Colleagues often praised her hard work, patience, and warm demeanor, and patients always felt they had her full attention. Outside of work, Rosemeir was an active, joyful individual who enjoyed socializing with friends, participating in charity events at her local church, and ensuring her loved ones felt happy and secure. Rosemeir had dreamed of her wedding day since childhood. In her mind, she envisioned walking down an aisle adorned with flowers, surrounded by the smiles of friends and family, dressed in a stunning white gown. These dreams had motivated her to save money diligently for the perfect celebration. One special touch she planned was her grand arrival by helicopter, a surprise that would captivate everyone in attendance. Udirli, then 30, was a mechanic who also hailed from São Paulo and grew up in a hard-working family that valued honesty and simplicity. From a young age, he showed a keen interest in mechanics and gradually built a career as a skilled professional. Udirli was known for being calm, composed, and dependable, with a reputation for always doing his job with integrity. He had previously been married, a union that ended in divorce, but he maintained a strong relationship with his daughter from that marriage, spending as much time with her as possible. The two met at an evangelical church, and while their connection wasn't immediate, it soon deepened. Initially, they approached their conversations cautiously, like two strangers unsure of their commonalities. However, their bond grew quickly, revealing that they were indeed meant for each other. The couple began dating in 2015, and within a year, Udirli proposed, a moment that Rosemeir joyfully embraced. Preparing for the wedding. When Rosemeir and Udirli announced their engagement, they dove into planning their wedding. Rosemeir was determined for everything to be perfect, from the choice of flowers and music to the seating arrangements and venue decorations. This day was meant to be a fairy tale, and Rosemeir envisioned each guest reminiscing about it with joy. One aspect of the wedding, however, stood out. Rosemeir planned an unforgettable surprise, her dramatic arrival by helicopter. This had been her dream, to make an entrance that would be remembered, descending from the sky like a vision. She arranged for a light commercial helicopter, a Robinson R-44, and made plans with pilot Peterson Pinheiro, keeping this detail under wraps. Only 6 people, including her brother Silvano Silva and photographer Neila Cristina Neves, who was set to capture the moment, knew of the plan. The final hours before the flight. On the morning of her wedding day, Rosemeir woke up early, unable to sleep due to excitement. At the beauty salon, she was met with smiles and congratulations as the stylists carefully worked on her hair and makeup. All the while, she imagined her grand entrance, descending from above and seeing the awe on her guests' faces. This vision had occupied her mind for months. She knew this surprise would be the highlight of the day. By 2 p.m., dressed in her white wedding gown, Rosemeir headed to a nearby town where the helicopter would take off. With her was her older brother Silvano, a 40-year-old who had always been her pillar of support. Although he, like many in their family, was uneasy about the flight, he couldn't deny his sister her wish. Photographer Neila, who was expecting a child, joined them, ready to document every joyful moment. By 3:30 p.m., the helicopter took off. Initially, the flight was smooth. Rosemeir sat beside her brother, holding his hand and smiling in anticipation of the moment she would see her fiancé and their guests. Neila captured it all on video, ensuring every glance and smile would be immortalized in their wedding album. The shift in the skies, But soon, things changed. The weather began to deteriorate as clouds gathered, followed by fog and rain. Despite this, the pilot remained confident in his abilities and continued. Below them were stretches of forest and roads, and the passengers, still unaware of the impending danger, chatted calmly. Moments leading up to the tragedy. Meanwhile, at the ceremony site, a subtle restlessness grew. Guests had gathered and were waiting for the event to begin. The officiant informed Udirli that his bride was running slightly late due to the changing weather conditions. Standing by the arch, Udirli fidgeted nervously with the fabric of his suit, not knowing where Rosemeir was, but certain she would arrive any minute. The officiant, who was aware of the surprise, maintained a composed demeanor and spoke occasionally with the organizers to ensure everything was proceeding as planned. Yet as the minutes ticked by, the organizers' concern started to mount. By 4 p.m., the absence of the helicopter began to seem ominous, tension on board. As the helicopter soared through worsening weather, the atmosphere inside grew tense. Visibility was dwindling, and the pilot had to rely on instruments to navigate through the dense fog. Silvano, already uneasy about flying, showed clear signs of anxiety, gripping Rosemeir's hand tightly as she tried to reassure him. Nayla, the photographer, kept recording, but her camera occasionally shook, betraying the tension that had overtaken everyone on board. Approaching the venue, the pilot attempted to descend to locate a safe landing spot. However, with visibility severely compromised, the maneuver turned risky. Suddenly, the helicopter's tail clipped a tree, triggering an uncontrollable descent. Just over a mile from the wedding site, the helicopter crashed, igniting on impact. The growing concern at the wedding. As time ticked by, those in on Rosemeir's surprise plan began to feel a sense of foreboding. Carlos Eduardo, the wedding coordinator who had helped organize the flight, called the helicopter company to check on its status. He was told that the flight had departed as scheduled and should have already arrived. This response deepened his worry, prompting him to try contacting the pilot directly. Every call went unanswered. The phone rang out without response, and Carlos and the other organizers scrambled to find alternative ways to track the helicopter's whereabouts. The company's staff also attempted to reach the pilot, but without success. Meanwhile, whispers and worried glances spread among the guests as they noticed Carlos's anxious demeanor. While no one wanted to spark alarm, the atmosphere grew thick with unease. The moment of realization. Another 15 minutes passed, and the anxious waiting turned to rising panic. The organizers decided to reach out to local authorities, trying to find out if there had been any reports of an incident nearby. That's when they received news confirming their worst fears, a report of a helicopter crash close to the wedding location. Although it was not confirmed if it was the same flight carrying Rosemeir, the information alone was enough to send a chill through everyone involved. Carlos Eduardo, unsure of how to break the news to the groom, confided in the pastor. Together they approached Udirli to share what they knew. There had been a report of a possible helicopter crash just a few miles away. At first, Udirli struggled to comprehend. He hadn't even known that Rosemeir planned to arrive by helicopter. The pastor gently explained that it had been a surprise Rosemeir arranged for the guests and for him, but the words seemed incomprehensible. Standing there in stunned silence, Udirli looked at the pastor and Carlos Eduardo as the realization set in. The world around him seemed to fade, the sounds of the gathering dulling into a silent void. All eyes turned toward him as the weight of the situation became clear. Rosemeir could have been on that helicopter. No one knew how to react, and the silence that followed felt endless. The arrival of the news. Within minutes, reports confirmed that emergency responders had reached the crash site. Initially, details were scarce as they worked to assess the situation. Police cordoned off the area to prevent onlookers from entering and began their investigation. Word of the crash filtered back to the wedding venue, intensifying the guests' anxiety with every passing moment. One of the event organizers advised waiting for official confirmation before jumping to conclusions, but everyone could sense that the chance of a hopeful outcome was slipping away. The groom could hear murmurs among the guests behind him, and he knew that nobody would share the truth until the details were certain. The event, meant to be a day of joy, was slowly descending into disarray as whispers spread like wildfire. The scene at the crash site. While the guests waited anxiously at the venue, first responders were already hard at work at the crash site. The helicopter had gone down in a wooded area not far from a highway. Upon impact, the fuselage had caught fire, and the flames quickly consumed what remained of the aircraft. Firefighters fought to contain the blaze, and after a while, they managed to reach the wreckage. It became clear that none of the passengers had survived, a revelation that sent shockwaves of grief and dread through those trying to piece together what had happened. Police officers began collecting evidence and examining the site for clues to understand the cause of the crash. Debris was scattered across a confined area, and one officer discovered a camera that had continued recording even after the impact. The footage could potentially provide crucial insights into the final moments of the flight. But for now, the reason behind the tragedy remained unknown, returning to a harsh reality. When the official confirmation of the crash finally reached the wedding venue, the hope for a miracle was shattered. The pastor, with a heavy heart, approached Udirli and broke the devastating news. Pain etched itself into the groom's expression as he struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. In that moment, the world seemed to collapse around him, and those who stood by his side were left in stunned silence, unsure how to respond to such overwhelming grief. Guests stricken by shock. The guests, who had arrived to celebrate love and happiness, now stood in stunned silence, uncertain of what to say or do. The ceremony, anticipated with so much joy, had devolved into a scene of disbelief and sorrow. What was meant to be a beautiful day was now a harsh reminder of how quickly a single error or unforeseen event could unravel lives and plans in mere moments. Investigative efforts begin. Investigators from Brazil's National Civil Aviation Agency commenced their analysis of the flight data and began gathering witness statements. Those who had attended the wedding or were aware of Rosemeir's plans were of particular interest. The inquiry aimed to uncover not just the technical reasons behind the crash, but also the motivation for her decision to take such a high-risk approach for her arrival. Aviation safety experts and police meticulously examined the wreckage. One of their first tasks was retrieving the flight data and reviewing recordings that could provide crucial insights. Determining why the helicopter veered off course and lost control was essential. While dense fog and worsening weather were potential factors, other possibilities were also on the table, such as pilot error or mechanical failure. Insight into the pilot's background. Witness accounts from those who knew the pilot, Peterson Pinheiro, added layers to the investigation. An experienced and highly regarded professional, Pinheiro was known for his caution and responsible handling of each flight. He had years of experience and had successfully completed many flights under challenging weather conditions. Colleagues noted that he was thorough in assessing risks before taking off. This background made the news of the crash all the more perplexing to those who worked with him. Many found it hard to believe that he could have made a critical mistake. However, the facts remained undeniable. In heavy fog and rain, the helicopter had clipped a tree and spun out of control. Investigators sought to piece together the final moments of the flight to determine if there had been any opportunity for a safe landing. A family in shock. While investigators worked at the crash site, the families of Rosemeir and Udirli were left grappling with unimaginable grief. Parents, siblings, and close friends struggled to accept that this tragedy had actually occurred. Rosemeir's sister, one of the few who knew about her plan to arrive by helicopter, recalled their discussions. Rosemeir had been so excited, full of enthusiasm at the thought of surprising everyone with her entrance. Yet no one could have anticipated that this would be the final flight of her life, Udirli's heartbreak. Standing by the wedding arch, Udirli struggled to process the loss. He saw guests and organizers trying to comfort one another, but it offered him no solace. The realization that he hadn't known about Rosemeir's surprise weighed heavily on him. He felt as though he had failed her, unable to protect her. What should have been the beginning of their life together had instead become his most painful memory. Initial investigation findings. Investigators soon released a preliminary report confirming that weather conditions played a critical role in the crash. The helicopter had encountered dense fog, severely limiting visibility. Pilot Peterson had attempted an emergency landing but clipped a tree with the tail of the aircraft, leading to a loss of control and the tragic crash. However, the investigation was far from over. It was essential to determine why the helicopter was flying at such a low altitude and why the pilot couldn't avoid the collision. The camera found among the wreckage could hold valuable clues for reconstructing the final moments of the flight, and experts began reviewing the footage. Painful as it was, this step was necessary to understand what had happened in those last moments. Aftermath at the ceremony. As the guests slowly began to leave the venue, an eerie silence hung over the space. No one had the strength to speak. The organizers worked to coordinate with local authorities, while Udirli's friends and family offered him as much support as they could. But lingering questions tormented everyone. Why did this happen? What could have caused such a devastating outcome? Rosemeir's family was also reeling, struggling to come to terms with the tragedy. Her mother, who had always been her biggest supporter, couldn't accept that their morning conversation was their last. She recalled how Rosemeir had spoken with excitement, calling her plan a gift from the skies that would amaze everyone. No one imagined that her dream would turn into such a nightmare. Questions and theories. Before long, new concerns emerged regarding the safety of the flight itself. Investigators discovered that the helicopter did not have authorization for charter services. Its license permitted only private flights. Why had the company agreed to provide it for the wedding? Who was responsible for overlooking the weather conditions? These questions spurred further inquiries and became a focal point of the investigation. Witness accounts and weather concerns. Some witnesses began to recall that in the days leading up to the wedding, weather forecasts had predicted poor conditions, yet little attention was given to these warnings. Pilot Peterson Pinheiro, known for his careful consideration of safety, would have had to factor in these conditions, yet the flight was still approved. The investigation now had to determine who made the final call to proceed with the flight, despite the clear risks. Udirli's grief and the overwhelming silence. As Udirli tried to gather his thoughts, each moment of waiting felt unbearable. He couldn't imagine a life without Rosemeir, who had brought so much light and warmth into his world. Their journey, which started with shy glances in church, was supposed to lead to a life of shared happiness. Now, it felt shattered, like a picture that could never be made whole again. The hall, once meant to echo with wedding music and joyous speeches, was enveloped in a heavy silence. Only soft cries, quiet words of comfort, and supportive embraces could be heard. No one knew what to say to Udirli or how to console a man who had just lost everything he cherished. The investigation and its impact. The investigation continued for weeks, but the helicopter crash that claimed the lives of Rosemeir, her brother Silvano, photographer Nayla, and pilot Peterson left a permanent scar on the hearts of their families and the wider community. While more facts came to light over time, one feeling persisted among those who knew the victims: an overwhelming sense of loss and bitter injustice. Final report from aviation authorities. A month after the tragic event, the Brazilian National Civil Aviation Agency completed its report. It confirmed that the primary factors contributing to the crash were the severe weather conditions and poor visibility. Pilot Peterson Pinheiro had attempted to navigate through dense fog and rain, but found himself in a critical situation when the helicopter lost control at a low altitude. The pivotal moment was the collision with a tree, which led to the fatal crash. The report also revealed that the helicopter used by Rosemeir did not have authorization for charter flights. Its registration only permitted private use, and allowing it to be used for a wedding was a violation of safety regulations. This revelation stirred anger among the victims' families and brought attention to the company that rented out the helicopter. Accountability and legal action. Further investigation showed that the company responsible for leasing the helicopter had failed to properly assess the weather conditions and allowed the flight to proceed despite warnings of poor visibility. This was deemed a serious breach, and after the investigation concluded, several lawsuits were filed against the company and its owners. The families of those who perished sought answers, wanting to know why the flight had been approved under such conditions and who should have made the decision to cancel it. The company's defense and legal fallout. The helicopter company claimed that the pilot had independently determined that the flight could be safely carried out. However, further evidence indicated that the company did not have authorization to use the aircraft for commercial purposes, sparking further scrutiny. This led to a temporary suspension of their licenses and a comprehensive audit of their operations. Families' unbearable grief. As the investigation pressed on, the families of Rosemeir and the other victims prepared for the funerals. It was a moment none of them wanted to face. It's one thing to see dreams shattered. It's another to come to terms with the absence of loved ones. The funeral was solemn and attended by hundreds who came to pay their respects. The silence and tears spoke volumes, expressing more than words ever could. Udirli stood by Rosemeir's casket, unable to find the words to convey his grief. His eyes were hollow and his spirit seemed hardened by the weight of his sorrow. He had envisioned spending his entire life with Rosemeir, but everything had changed in an instant. Standing before her casket, he felt as though his heart might break completely. He couldn't say goodbye, unable to accept that this was truly the end. Calls for change. After the funeral, Rosemeir's family and friends launched a campaign advocating for increased safety measures in private aviation. Their hope was that no one else would ever endure such a devastating loss due to oversight or negligence. This tragedy resonated with the public, garnering widespread support for stricter regulations and mandatory oversight to ensure flight safety compliance. Rosemeir's memory, along with that of her brother and the other victims, was honored in their local church, a place they frequented. Despite his pain, Udirli resolved to keep their legacy alive. He established a small fund to help families affected by similar tragedies, offering them resources to navigate their grief. The final report. After several months, investigators released their final report. It confirmed that the main cause of the tragedy was severe weather conditions and limited visibility, leading to the loss of control. A contributing factor was the company's failure to follow proper rental procedures and adequately assess the risks involved. The company was fined and had its flight licenses temporarily revoked until all identified shortcomings were addressed. Although the investigation provided many answers, it could not bring back those who were lost. While families received compensation, it did little to ease the pain of their grief. For Udirli and everyone who knew Rosemeir, it was merely a symbolic gesture that couldn't undo what had happened. Months after the tragedy, life slowly resumed its usual rhythm for most. But for Udirli, this was impossible. He continued to go to work and meet with friends, but the spark that once lit his eyes was gone. The loss of Rosemeir left a void in his heart that nothing could fill. In the evenings, he often found himself revisiting memories of the happiness they shared and wishing that day could have ended differently. What began as a dream for an extraordinary surprise revealed how fragile life truly is and how a single ill-fated decision can change everything. Rosemeir wanted her wedding day to be unforgettable, and in a tragic way, it was, but not in the way she had imagined.